De 57-jarige Diaz-Canel is sinds donderdag 19 april 2018 officieel de nieuwe president van Cuba. Miguel Diaz-Canel werd woensdag formeel voorgedragen door de Nationale Assemblée van Cuba en volgt Raúl Castro op als president van het land. De 86-jarige Castro is na 10 jaar met pensioen gegaan. Raúl Castro zou in februari dit jaar al afzwaaien, maar vanwege orkaan Irma, die op 9 september 2017 het land teisterde, werd dit verschoven. Cuba heeft geen reguliere presidentsverkiezingen. De nieuwe president wordt gekozen door parlementariërs van de Nationale Assemblée. Raúl Castro blijft wel hoofd van het leger en voorzitter van de communistische partij, waartoe ook Diaz-Canel behoort. Met het terugtreden van Raúl Castro als leider van Cuba krijgt het land voor het eerst sinds de jaren 60 een leider die niet uit de Castro-familie komt. Raúl Castro volgde in 2008 zijn broer Fidel op, die gezondheidsproblemen had.
Miguel Diaz-Canel, 57 years old, a one-time electrical engineer. For the past 30 years, he's been a communist bureaucrat, slowly rising through the levels of power. Effective immediately, he is Cuba's new president. It was not much of a surprise in the vote. 603 votes out of 604 delegates in the National Assembly all voted for him. That's 99.8%. What do we know about him? He is pro-censorship of the internet. He is anti-small, free private business in Cuba. So really, it doesn't look like he's going to rock the boat too much here in Cuba, Bill.
You wonder how things could change on the ground for ordinary Cubans. Doesn't sound like much, or does it, Steve?
Well, the word they keep using here among officials is continuity. We're going to continue things just like they have always been. And keep in mind, Raúl Castro is not leaving the scene entirely. He's still going to remain as first secretary of the Communist Party, a very powerful position here. And even critics of the regime here, especially in Florida, are saying nothing has changed. This is not a real election. This is just theater. The real question is the system that Fidel and Raúl built and hung on to for 60 years. Are they going to be able to hang on to it even after they've left power?
Well, Miguel Diaz-Canel has a reputation for competence, for integrity, and for being committed not only to preserving what are the social conquests of the Cuban Revolution, its independence, but also participating at the center of the updating of the Cuban economy. He grew up in Villa Cara, which is a very important province, as an electronics engineer, served in various Cuban internationalist missions abroad, and is now served as Minister of Higher Education, and will now be taking on possibly one of the most important posts that is obviously the most important post he's ever held, which will be President of the Council of State. Today or tomorrow, the 605 members of Cuba's elected National Assembly will choose the 23 members of the Council of State, 5 vice presidents, the first vice president, and the new president of Cuba.
The new president of Cuba, although interesting to note that Raúl Castro will stay essentially as Secretary of the Communist Party until 2021. So what type of power will this president actually have if a Castro is still part of the greater regime?
Well, I think there's always been collective leadership in Cuba, even under Fidel Castro. People often failed to see the institutionalization of the Cuban Revolution because Fidel Castro was such a larger-than-life figure. He transcended the island. But there's always been collective leadership in Cuba. And Raúl Castro carries not only the moral authority of his long service in Cuba, but also being member of the historic generation that made the revolution. So what we're witnessing is what is obviously an inevitable reality, is the handing over of the baton of revolutionary politics from the generation that made the revolution to the generations that were born during and within the Cuban Revolution. So Canel will have a significant amount of authority and a significant amount of input within a collective leadership process.
So significant impact. Will that mean changes for the Cuban people? Does that mean changes with the international community?
Well, I think an important thing to bear in mind is there's a significant consensus throughout Cuba to preserve Cuba's independence, which was won. They would argue in 1959, I think that's a very strong case, and also preserve what is a system that has received praise in terms of education, healthcare, social security, and protecting human dignity across the world in various United Nations and other international organization documents. But of course, Cuba is looking to the international climate, and many of us are always wary of what the Trump regime in the United States will do. It's very unpredictable, and since the opening of relations, the move towards what we call the formalization of diplomatic relations and the lessening of tensions between Cuba and the United States that were initiated under the former President Obama, since Trump has rolled back many of those measures, people are quite concerned that we're returning possibly to a hyper-aggressive United States policy against Cuba. So Cubans are very concerned about this, and as many people across the world are, and of course we'll be looking towards what will be happening from Washington.
And what about political freedoms internally, though? You're talking about mainly international relations, but as we said right off top, one of the greatest criticisms of the Castro regime has been a clampdown on political freedoms. Will that change with this generational change that you're talking about?
Well, the Cubans have always said that a major condition of Cuba's existence has been the U.S. economic hostility. And not only economic hostility, it's included a U.S.-sponsored invasion and various subversion campaigns. Cubans are wedded to the idea of national independence. And they often argue that the Cuban Revolution began not in 1959 or not in 1953 when the Moncada attack took place, but goes back to these independence struggles in the 19th century. So Cubans are very much historically and in present contemporary terms wedded to this idea of independence and wedded to this idea of preserving the kind of social conquest they have gained. As I mentioned, the universal health care, the education, social security, and a country that's widely recognized as the safest country in Latin America and the Caribbean. So they believe in the idea of self-determination, and they won't have that dictated to them by external powers. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. As long as U.S. hostility maintains, Cuba will do all its best to maintain its independence and its social conquest.
For over a half century, Cuba and the Castros have gone hand in hand. Often clad in green military fatigues, Fidel ruled the island nation as a dictator, squashing dissent and confronting a superpower just 90 miles away in America. Now, in a historic power shift, a new face is assuming power in Cuba. His name is Miguel Diaz-Canel, and he's been lurking in the background, standing shoulder to shoulder with Fidel and his brother Raul. And yet, all the while, he was slowly moving up the ranks, becoming the country's vice president in 2013. It's the first time a non-Castro will be president in more than 40 years. He takes over from Raul, who succeeded his older brother in 2008. It's also the first time that someone who wasn't part of the revolution takes the reins. Raul Castro had put in place rules that limit a president to 2 5-year terms, and he's lived up to that.
El 19 de abril del próximo año, Cuba tendrá un nuevo presidente.
But Castro's not exactly disappearing. He will continue to head the Communist Party, arguably the most powerful political post in Cuba.
El sustituto de Fidel solo lo puede ser el Partido Comunista de Cuba.
So this is a slow changing of the guard, but it signals a huge shift in how Cuba will operate, politically and economically. Unlike the Castros, who established their legitimacy through the Communist Revolution, Diaz-Canel will have to cement his role by delivering on some much-needed reforms, including fixing the island's two-currency system. As it stands, there's both a national currency and another one pegged to the US dollar, effectively barring parts of the population from purchasing certain basic goods and from actively participating in the larger economy.
Cambio lo que esperamos todos. Por lo menos nosotros los jóvenes pasamos mucho trabajo porque hay muchas cosas que están muy caras todavía. A veces el trabajo no te da para llegar hasta allá.
Diaz-Canel also needs to cultivate more opportunities for the country's restive youth.
I hope that the line that Raul Castro established a few years ago can be steadily improving, and more businesses, more licenses. That's what I hope.
Diaz-Canel is likely to maintain Cuba's ties with Russia and China as relations with the U.S. continue to sour. He has also said that he plans to expand access to the internet.
El Estado trabajará para que este recurso esté disponible, accesible y costeable para todos.
But on the question of human rights, like censorship, Cuba's tight grip is likely to take longer to loosen.
Hay todo un grupo avalancha de propuestas y proyectos con contenido subversivo que todos los días se están analizando, Que digan que censuramos, está bien. Aquí todo el mundo censura.
So just how did Diaz-Canel emerge in a country whose rulers have had an iron grip on power? He grew up 170 miles east of Havana in Santa Clara, where he worked as an engineering professor and a local Communist Party leader. From there, he went on to become the youngest ever member, at 43 years old, of the Politburo, the most powerful body within the Communist Party. He was appointed Minister of Higher Education in 2009 and was handpicked to be vice president in 2013. Experts say he rose by keeping a low profile and towing the country's line. And with Raúl keeping close watch over his rule, any change will likely come slow.